This is my presentation on Friedrich Schleiermacher, his preference for moving the reader towards the writer, and his distinction between the two types of translator for commercial and literary text. Friedrich Schleiermacher was a celebrated theologian, philosopher, historian and translator in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. He is often associated with the German Romantic movement and is thought to have been strongly influenced by Johann Gottfried Herder, particularly regarding the difficulties of removing a text from its cultural context. Schleiermacher was part of a new generation of thinkers who began to explore modes of translation that would preserve what they called the foreignness of the foreign text, making it accessible to German readers without sacrificing as much of its particular character as had previously been thought inevitable. Schleiermacher was heavily influenced by the field of hermeneutics. A devout Christian and preacher, he was initially interested in religious texts and their analysis, but wanted to shift away from more specific methods of interpretation towards a focus on the way people understand text in general. He thought one could only analyse properly once he or she had established a system of interpretation that was applicable to all texts. These thoughts are what ultimately caused the author to produce the text. Thus, the place where these inner thoughts become outer expression in language is at the moment of text creation. This is where the meaning of text ultimately resides for Schleiermacher. In order to interpret a text, then, the interpreter must consider both the inner thoughts of the author and the language that she or he used in writing. Now to evaluate the importance of Schleiermacher's preference for moving the reader towards the writer. Schleiermacher's seminal essay on the different methods of translation was first given as a lecture on the 24th of June 1813. In it, he underlines his idea that the translator must either leave the writer in peace as much as possible and move the reader towards him, or leave the reader in peace as much as possible and move the writer towards him. Schleiermacher's aim is to give the reader, through the translation, the impression he would have received as a German reading the work in the original language. He wants to give the reader an inkling, if only a distant one, of the original language and what the work owes to it, thus compensating some of what he loses for not understanding the original tongue. As we have seen earlier, Schleiermacher emphasized the significance of the inner thoughts of the author becoming outer expression. He therefore prioritizes the author in his method. He wanted to give the reader a sense not only of the texture of that language, but of what it would mean to have grown up speaking it, and aimed at the development of a national mindset and internationally orientated cultural literacy. The German Romantic movement in general were interested in how translation could be a means for improving German literature and culture. They centered on the issues of translatability or untranslatability and the mythical nature of translation. Therefore, Schleiermacher here is exploring the avenues of translatability and untranslatability. Schleiermacher's views are still widely respected today, but they are limiting and have been expanded upon by many modern-day translation theorists. In Schleiermacher's theory, the translator must either move the reader to the writer or the writer to the reader. He claims that any attempt to combine the two would be certain to produce a highly unreliable result, and the writer and reader might miss one another completely. Furthermore, from a semantic point of view, it is impossible that language use of the translator could cohere everywhere in exactly the same way as that of the author. For example, in poetry, the recreation of both semantic and musical aspects of the original are difficult to recreate simultaneously. The word with the closest semantic fit might not reproduce the intended rhyme. Kittel and Poltermann argue that practically every modern translational theory, at least in the German language area, responds in one way or another to Schleiermacher's hypothesis. We can see development of his text-type ideas in Katharina Ries and Mary Snell Hornby's theoretical frameworks. His alienation and naturalization can be found in Venuti's foreignizing versus domesticating, and his description of hermeneutics is visible in George Steiner's hermeneutic motion. Now to discuss how far we would agree with Schleiermacher's distinction between the two types of translator. Schleiermacher distinguishes between the interpreter that plies his trade in the area of business and the translator proper in the areas of science and art. It's this second type that he sees as being on the higher creative plane. Schleiermacher considers that the areas of art and science are best served by the written word, which alone can make their works endure. But for business transactions, however, writing is only a mechanical means. Verbal negotiation is their original mode, and every written interpretation should be seen only as the record of a spoken exchange. Schleiermacher argues along the lines that business translation has more predefined terminology between the two languages and two parties sufficiently familiar with the subject, whereas in art and science, Not a single word in one language will correspond perfectly to a word in another. However, Schleiermacher continues to explain that negotiation in business is often subject to a specific framework already agreed upon by the two parties, that the parties are already sufficiently familiar with the affairs, and that language is often determined in advance either by law, usage, or mutually agreed upon conventions. He continues that other forms of negotiation are quite a different matter when they are intended to establish new frameworks. In this case, the scientific knowledge is required in their very composition, and the greater the knowledge of the technical details and terminology needed by the translator. Taking these limitations into account, as in Jeremy Monday, I would argue that Mary Snell Hornby uses her integrated approach to translation to bridge the gap between the commercial and artistic translations described by Schleiermacher. Her attempts include a wide variety of different linguistics and literary concepts in an overarching integrated approach to translation based on text types. There are, as ever, limitations to Snell Hornby's approach. As argued by Monday, can all newspaper text be lumped together as general language translation? Some may be quite specialised in technical, scientific, financial, or sporting areas. Can film translation be treated purely as literary? I take Schleiermacher's point that the more the author is visible in the text, the harder it is to translate, as we must try to put ourselves in the author's shoes, taking into account their way of thinking, their politics, their ethics, among other things. I would argue that Schleiermacher's dichotomizing view of interpreter versus translator proper, business versus art, is too limiting. Text types should be seen more as a cline, as in Snell Hornby, than as two opposing genres. Whilst Snell Hornby's framework also has its limitations, we will never be able to put all text into exact categories, and it allows for much more flexibility in interpretation.